This Shabbos, there are two different titles to the Shabbos. Number one, it's the Shabbos in which the Torah reading is the portion called V'etchanan. And it's a portion that has in it so many of the fundamentals of Judaism. Number one, it has the Shema, perhaps the most hallowed verse in the whole Torah. The words that every Jew recites at least twice daily. It's the words that a Jew recites at the end of their life. It's the verse that tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Jews said before they were murdered during the Holocaust and other periods of persecution. So that verse, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, God is our God, God is one, is mentioned at the first time and the only time in the Torah, in this week's Torah portion. It also has the Ten Commandments. Even though the Ten Commandments were mentioned in the book of Exodus, that is when the Ten Commandments were first given. But the book of Deuteronomy is where Moses repeats the Ten Commandments. He repeats a lot of things, among them the Ten Commandments. As I always try to point out, the word Ten Commandments is actually a misnomer. There are more than 10 commandments in the Torah. There are 613. But these are 10 statements. That's how the Torah describes them, 10 declarations, 10 statements that contain within them commandments, and more than 10 actually. So this very central part of Judaism, the 10 commandments, are mentioned again in this week's Torah portion because Moses is repeating many of the things that he already told them in the last 40 years that they were in the desert. It also contains a commandment against intermarriage. One of the sad aspects of Jewish life where Jews are losing their identities. Well, this is the Torah portion in which the Torah makes it very clear that Jews, in order to preserve their identities, have to look into within their own community for marriage. There's also another very fundamental verse where it says, you shall know today and return it to your heart that God is the God in the heavens above and the earth below. There is nothing else. Very fundamental verse that emphasizes the idea of God's oneness. So we have time, we'll go into each of these things. But the Torah portion begins with Moses recounting how he would plead to God, implore God, beseech God to let him go into the land of Israel. So that's the first aspect of the Shabbos, the Torah reading, V'etchanan, and we'll get back into it in a moment. But there's another feature of this Shabbos, and that's the prophetic reading. Every Shabbos we read the Torah, the selection of the Torah that we conclude in the course of a year. But in the end of each Torah reading, we also read a selection from the prophets. The reason for that is there was a period when the government banned the Torah reading.
Yes. So
instead of the Torah reading, the Jewish people took a selection from the prophets that had something analogous to the Torah reading, so the people shouldn't forget the Torah reading. And once that was established, even after the ban against Torah reading was removed, we still read the selection from the prophets. And every week there's a special selection that corresponds to the Torah reading. This week, the prophetic reading, called the Haftarah, doesn't deal with the theme of the Torah portion, at least not explicitly, but it relates to the time of the year in which we are in right now. Today is the day after Tisha B'Av, the day after the national day of mourning the destruction of the two temples and other tragedies that happened on this day. And today, and the rest of the week, culminating with Shabbos, we focus on consolation, how God comforts us after the tragedies that happened. God comforts us. And this is taken from the book of Isaiah, where the prophet begins, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, console, console my nation. And so this Shabbos is referred to in many places as Shabbat Nachamu, the Shabbos of consolation. So we'll talk about that as well. But let's first begin with the opening verse of V'etchanan. And I'll read it in English translation. I requested from God at that time, I would translate it more than requested, I implored God. I pleaded with him. But whatever tone you want to use, Moses is telling us that he prayed to God, and he says to God, God Almighty, you have begun to show your kindness and your strong hand to your servant. For who is like God in heaven and on earth, who can perform deeds and mighty acts like you? Please let me cross over and see the good land that is on the other side of the Jordan, this good mountain and the Lebanon, an allusion to Jerusalem and the Holy Temple. But God became angry with me because of you, because of the people, and he did not listen to me. God said to me, do not speak to me anymore about this matter. So Moses is telling us that he prayed to God, but he didn't just pray one prayer. Our sages tell us that he prayed as many prayers as the numerical value of the word V'etchanan, and I prayed, and I pleaded, and I implored. And that adds up to 515. So Moses prayed 515 prayers until God says, that's it. I don't want to hear any more from you. And once God told him that, Moses ceased praying. Now, it's interesting, if those who dabble in numerology, gematria, that the Hebrew word for prayer, tefillah, also adds up to 515. There's another word relates to prayer, shira, song, because prayer is a combination of requests of God and praises of God, which we say as a song. The word shira also adds up to 515. So there's something about prayer that combines tefillah, which is usually understood to mean requests of God, and shira and singing praises. Those are the two elements of prayer. So Moses says, I prayed and God said no. Now, even though God said no, God did give him some break. What does God say to him? God says to him, go up to the top of the hill and lift up your eyes westward, northward, southward, and eastward, and see it with your eyes, for you will not cross this Jordan. In other words, God says to Moses, I'm not going to let you cross with your legs, but I'll let you cross with your eyes. You're going to see, I'm going to show you the entire land, north, south, east, west. What's the significance of all this? Why was Moses so adamant about crossing over? It's not that Moses wanted to live longer. I'm sure everyone wants to live longer. He was 120 years old, and he wanted to live longer. But that's not what Moses was asking for. He didn't want to live longer outside of Israel. He wanted to cross the Jordan to go be in Israel. Why? Why would he care so much about that? So there's a passage in the Talmud that explains it. The Talmud says that God says to Moses, Moses, why do you want to cross the Jordan to go to Israel? Do you want to eat its fruit? No, that's not your interest. Moses was not interested in the material benefits and blessings that Israel is known for. God says to Moses himself, you wanted to go there so you can fulfill, there are many mitzvahs, many commandments that you can only fulfill in Israel, and you wanted to get this reward for all these mitzvahs. You know what, Moses? I will give you the credit for all those mitzvahs as if you had crossed the Jordan. In other words, whatever benefits you wanted to get by crossing over, by doing all those mitzvahs that you can only do in Israel, I'll give you the credit without crossing over. Well, that begs a very strong question. Our sages tell us in Ethics of the Fathers that you should not serve God with the intent of getting reward. Yes, there is reward for every good deed that you do. There's reward. God will never remain in debt. If he doesn't reward us in this world, he rewards us in the next world, in the afterlife. That's for sure. But even though there's reward, the ideal person doesn't serve God in order to get the reward. He serves God because this is what God wants him to do. This is the right thing. So, of all people, Moses, who was the greatest human being that ever lived, nobody has ever come as close to God as Moses, the greatest prophet, the most humble person on the face of the earth. And yet Moses, God is telling Moses that you want to go there to get the reward, because you can get more reward if you go into Israel than if you stay outside of Israel. Why would Moses entertain that objective of crossing over? If Moses said, I want to cross over because I wanted to do a mitzvah, because I wanted to serve you, God, that would have made sense. But for reward? So one way of understanding this, that when we talk about reward can be defined two ways. Reward can be defined, I do something that's proper, someone asked me to do him a favor, and later on he sends me a gift. That's a reward. You shouldn't do a favor because you're expecting to get a reward of getting a gift. If you get the gift, it's great, it's wonderful, but that shouldn't be your motive for doing what's right. That's one understanding of reward, and God rewards us in kind that way also. It says in the Talmud that God does not withhold reward from any creature, even from an animal. The Talmud says that when the dogs in Egypt didn't bark at the time of the Exodus, God rewarded the dogs that when you have non-kosher meat, you throw it to the dogs. It's a reward for the dogs for not barking. So even a dog gets a reward. You'll throw a bone to the dog. That's the classic metaphor for giving someone a reward for what they do. That's a low level of reward, but there's a higher level of reward. The Ethics and the Fathers says the greatest reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. That is the greatest reward, that when you do a mitzvah, you have the benefit of the mitzvah. And what is the benefit of the mitzvah? There are many benefits, but one of the benefits of the mitzvah is that it refines you. It makes you a better person. It makes you a more spiritual person. It makes you a more godly person. It connects you to God. In fact, the word mitzvah has two meanings, at least two meanings, maybe more than two, but at least two. One meaning is commandment, and the other meaning is attachment, a bond. When you do a mitzvah, you create an attachment and a bond with God. There's nothing greater than that, having a relationship, and not just a relationship, but a very intimate relationship where you connect to God. That's what a mitzvah's reward is all about. It's not about getting a gift in return for the mitzvah, that too, but it's about connecting to God and having a close relationship with God. So then why did Moses want to cross over the Jordan into the land of Israel? So that if we examine the words of the Talmud carefully, it doesn't say that he did it so to do a mitzvah. It says that the mitzvah shall be done through me. What does that mean? A mitzvah shall be done through me. It's an awkward way of saying that I should do the mitzvah. So one explanation is that the Rabbi gives is that Moses was concerned not for himself. Moses had no ego. Moses was totally selfless. Everything he did for his people. He never cared about his own personal needs, only the people. He knew that when they cross over the Jordan, and he's not going to be their leader, and he won't be there to do all the mitzvahs, the spiritual state of the people will go downhill. They'll degenerate. And even after they will build the temple will not last. Why? Because the people, in order for the temple to last, the people have to appreciate what the temple means. It has to have an effect on them. If people, in spite of the temple's existence, behave in a very immoral way, then it would bring an end to the temple. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. The Jews were in the land of Israel for about 400 years before they built the final temple. The temple lasted a little over 400 years, 410 years. So about 800 years of living in Israel, they degenerated into idol worship, into immorality, into bloodshed. So the temple was destroyed, and it brought terrible devastation to the Jewish people. Moses wanted to avert that. Moses wanted to cross over the Jordan because he knew that his spiritual efforts, by him doing those mitzvahs that are connected to the land of Israel, that would enhance the mitzvahs of every Jew, that every Jew's mitzvahs would have an effect on them. And the effect would be that they would be morally at a high level, and they wouldn't have degenerated into immorality and all the vices that idolatry that they practiced led them to. And in that case, the temple that would be built would never be destroyed. And if the temple would never be destroyed, that would have been the ultimate messianic age. And there would be no need for all the suffering and all the pain that accompanied the destruction of the temple, of the first temple, and then again after the second temple, and all the other tragedies that we suffered in exile, and we're still suffering in exile, even though we have access to the land of Israel. The land of Israel is not what we're praying for the final redemption. The final redemption is a redemption where you don't have terrorism, you don't have Hamas, you don't have anti-Semitism, at the very least, if not all the other ills of society we get rid of as well. So Moses was concerned that by his not crossing over the Jordan, the mitzvahs that the people would do would not be full, would not be complete, would not be as wholesome and as perfect as the mitzvahs that he would do and influence them to do, so that their mitzvahs would bring the reward. What reward are we talking about? Not a physical reward or payment for their good deeds, but it would have the effect that a mitzvah is supposed to have. It would connect them to God in a way that they would never go downhill, and there would never be a destruction of the temple, and there would never be the suffering and pain. Moses was singularly focused and obsessed with the future of the Jewish people. And that's what we mean by reward. Not reward as payment, but reward as seeing the full effects of the mitzvahs that he would do, and that how it would inspire others to do the mitzvahs themselves in a very high level that would never allow them to go downhill, that would lead ultimately to the exile. And that's the connection, one of the connections to the second theme of this Shabbat, Shabbat Nachamu, the Shabbat of consolation. What we mean by consolation is that even though the temple was destroyed, but God says it's not the end. Temple will be rebuilt. But with what power? What's the power? The people degenerated. The people experienced a tremendous lowering of their standards that led to the exile. And the answer is that Moses' effects on the land of Israel and on the Jewish people for all posterity was still there, even though he didn't cross over. Because by him looking at the land, his visualizing and looking at the land implanted in the land of Israel the potential for it to come back, to bounce back. Because look at all the different nations in the world, all the different empires that ruled the world all the way back to ancient times. The Egyptian Empire, the Philistine Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire. All these empires have long gone. And we are still here and still strong, and Judaism in many ways is getting stronger, and the Jewish people are getting stronger in many ways. Yes, there are many problems that we have, and we have to deal with them, but on another level, the cumulative power that we have, spiritual power, will ultimately bring us to the consolation, to the coming of Mashiach. But where do we get the power to maintain such a high standard in spite of all the gullus, of all the exile, in spite of all the degradation, in spite of all the downs? How do we maintain ourselves? What gave us this power to last forever? The answer is Moses. Because Moses' influence, though it didn't work to forestall the decline that ultimately led to the destruction, it nevertheless aided us and armed us with the power to survive even in exile and to bounce back. And that's why our sages tell us that Moses was the first redeemer, He got us out of Egypt, and Moses will be the final Redeemer. Now, what does that mean? Moses is not Mashiach. Mashiach is a separate individual, but it's the power of Moses that he kept us alive, even in the exile, that will ultimately lead us to Mashiach. So Mashiach possesses within himself the power of Moses that enabled us to survive. And where did Moses, and what caused Moses to give us that power? It's when God told him to go to the top of the hill and look at the land, north, south, east, west. By his visualizing the land, he instilled in the land and in the people who possess the land ultimately the power of resilience, the power of bouncing back, and ultimately leading inevitably, inexorably to the final redemption. Let's talk a little bit about the words of the prophet, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Console, console my nation. Double consolation. Two words. The words are repeated. Words are repeated very often, you would think, for poetic license. It's a more poetic way of saying something. Or a word is combined. A word is repeated in order to emphasize how important the idea is. For example, the Torah says when it talks about charity, naton titain, give you shall give. Why does it repeat the word? To impress upon us the importance of this mitzvah. But there's also another explanation. The Abarbanel, one of the great Bible commentators, who was one of the Jews who were expelled from Spain. Actually, he wasn't expelled. Ferdinand and Isabella let him stay because he was the finance minister of Spain. She needed his services, but he himself left Spain with all the other Jews who were expelled in 1492, which incidentally occurred on Tisha B'Av. That's the day the Jews were expelled. And the next day, Columbus set sail for America. And some people speculate that the reason why Columbus didn't sail the day before, he was scheduled to sail the day before, because it was Tisha B'Av, a day of mourning, and Columbus was a Jew. Some people have that theory, and he didn't want to leave on this journey on a day that is very sad, a day that is ominous with all the tragedies that occurred. But there's a more simple explanation why he didn't leave then, because so many boats were leaving the harbor, because Jews had to leave that day. That was the deadline. He couldn't get his ship out of the harbor. But whatever it is, the expulsion from Spain is linked to the destruction of the temple, because every negative thing that happens in exile ultimately comes from the destruction of the temple. And the reason for that is the temple was not just a structure where people come to pray. It's not just a place that God says, I want you to bring sacrifices. The temple was a place that when you entered the temple, you were imbued with a sense of holiness. And if you didn't fight against, you weren't resistant to that feeling of holiness, you would become a different person. If every mitzvah refines you and makes you a different person, that's one mitzvah. The temple represented 1,000 mitzvahs. I don't mean 1,000 commandments. I mean, it multiplies the effect of a mitzvah 1,000-fold. So going to the temple itself without resisting the influence would prevent all the tragedies from happening. Because the temple was destroyed and we were exposed to the exile conditions, we became very vulnerable, and therefore many other tragedies happened on Tisha B'Av, including the expulsion from Spain, and including World War I began on Tisha B'Av. And anyone who knows a little history knows that there were not two world wars. There was one world war that was not finished with the end of the First World War. The Second World War was a continuation of the First World War. So it all started on Tisha B'Av, and many other great, terrible tragedies. The Talmud itself lists 5 tragedies of Tisha B'Av, but besides that, there were many others. So when we talk about the consolation, there's a double consolation, Barbanel says. What are the double consolation? The 2 temples. We lost 2 temples, not one. So we have to be consoled doubly. So according to that, the question remains, But there was only one temple at a time. Why do we need to have double consolation? We just have to build one temple. The third temple is just one. So one explanation is that each temple had a different objective. The first temple was built at a much higher level of spirituality than the second temple. It was built by King Solomon, who was totally independent. We were not subject to any of the nations of the world. We were not in any form of exile. And the first temple, therefore, had much more spiritual energy in it. The Talmud says that there were 5 things that you had in the first temple you didn't have in the second temple. Many of the miracles that occurred in the first temple did not occur in the second temple. One of the things that was missing, there were many things missing, but one of them, the most important, was the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant was the holiest object that ever existed, and that was in the first temple. At the end of the first temple era, the Ark was taken out and was hidden somewhere. And there's some controversy in the Talmud where it was hidden, but Maimonides accepts the opinion that it was buried beneath the surface of the temple. It's still there right now in a subterranean tunnel. And when Mashiach comes, it'll be revealed and will be brought back into the third temple. So the first temple was a much holier place than the second temple. But sometimes when something is very holy and you're not holy, it bounces off you. You have to be receptive to it. But when something is very powerful, if, let's say, to use a simple analogy, if Einstein would walk into a classroom and start to discuss his theory of relativity, it would bounce off the students. He's the greatest physicist alive, but yet he couldn't get his message through to the students because he's too high for them. He's too sophisticated, and it's beyond their level. So the first temple had an advantage that it had a much greater spiritual power, but it had the disadvantage that the people it often bounced off the people. That's why the people degenerated into idol worship, which is the antithesis of the temple, which reveals God's oneness, because it bounced off them. The second temple had the deficiency that it didn't have as much spirituality as the first temple, but it was not beyond the level of the people to access it and absorb it. It was on their level. It was like a high school teacher giving a class in physics to high school students. Though he's much more knowledgeable than they are, he could get his message through. But if he's a good teacher, they'll understand. So the second temple had the advantage over the first temple that it had a greater effect on people. Although it was not as powerful, the holiness was not as powerful as the first, but they were able to receive it and absorb it. The first temple was holier, but it was not always that easy for people to absorb. The third temple will combine the qualities of both temples. The third temple will be as holy, if not holier, than the first temple, but God will give us the ability to absorb it even the way we are today. We will be able to absorb the holiness and the power of the first temple. Sometimes there are things that are good, and we can't take it. We can't be showered with too much blessing because human beings have their limits. That's because we are living in exile. When Mashiach comes, those limits will no longer be there. That's why we have a double consolation, because we're going to get both benefits. It'll be two packaged in one temple. On a simpler level, one could explain the reason for the double expression of Nachamu and only one temple, not two temples. We're going to get one. Because if you think about it, the reason for the destruction of the two temples are very different on the surface, but if we dig deeper, we'll discover that it's really one essential flaw that was responsible for the destruction of both temples. What was the flaw of the first temple? What was the reason for the destruction? The main reason was idol worship. People degenerated into idol worship. The second temple was destroyed because people couldn't get along. They harbored hatred towards one another. Senseless hatred is the term that's used. They sound like two totally different flaws, worshiping an idol and having hatred. But if you think about it, they come from the same source, and the source is ego. when a person, what's the idea of worshiping an idol? Worshiping an idol means that you create your own God. You are the one who creates God. Not instead of believing that God created us, the idolater, the idol-worshiping individual believes that he can create God, that he can dictate to God what he wants. You want to be an adulterer? You go to the god of Venus. You want to be a murderer? You go to the god of Mars. You create your own gods, because you are the God. So idol worship is really self-worship. Another type of idol worship we have these days is money. We worship money. Becomes our own God. I heard this not too long ago. There was a rabbi from Antwerp, a very great rabbi, Rabbi Kreiswirth, and he wanted to become an American citizen. So when the judge asked him, what do you find about America that's the best thing about America, and what's the worst thing about America? He said, the best thing about America is that on the currency it has the words, "In God we trust." Okay, what's the worst thing about America? That on the dollar bill, we worship the dollar bill as our God. So on one hand, it's great, God we trust, but on the other hand, it seems to be that we trust in the dollar, the mighty dollar. So that's also based on ego. The whole pursuit of money and of power is all about ego. And why do people not get along with one another? It's because of their ego. If a person's ego is big, he can't tolerate the existence of the other. As one chassid once complained to his Rebbe, he says, "Why is it when I go to the synagogue, everybody steps on me?" So the Rebbe answered, "Because you spread yourself out and you cover the whole area. You don't leave any room for anyone else. So they have no other place to step but on you. If you wouldn't spread yourself out, if you wouldn't let your ego take over, people would not have to step on you. There's room for everyone." One of the miracles in the temple was that even though it was so crowded, people were squeezed like sardines. Whenever they had to bow down, there was room for everyone. In the city of Jerusalem, it was very crowded. No one ever complained that there was no room to sleep, no place to sleep. In other words, when you're in the atmosphere of the holy temple, there's room for everyone. But if you're in the atmosphere of your own ego, then there's no room for anyone else but yourself. So if you look at it, both temples were destroyed because of an exaggerated ego. The first temple because they worshipped idols, which is really self-worship. And the second temple, it was worshiping themselves to the extent that there was no room for anyone else. When Mashiach comes, and we pray every day that he comes today, those two ills will be remedied, because in the third temple, God's presence will be so powerful and it will be felt by everyone. As I said before, it's not going to be just showering holiness on people, but people can't pick it up, they can't absorb it. Everyone will absorb it, and that will be the end of our inflated egos, and we'll get along, and of course that will negate all forms of idolatry. And that, therefore, Nachamu, Nachamu, double consolation.